Ladies and gentlemen, casual fans and constant readers, welcome one and all to iWizard. Today I'm going to be talking about Stephen King's book On Writing. And specifically, I'm going to be distilling this book down to what I think are the 10 most important writing principles that you can take with you in your life as an aspiring writer or even just as a creator in general. Stephen King is a master of horror and fantasy literature. The guy's written probably more than 100 books at this point, and most of those have been bestsellers. So let's look at what Stephen King says are the most important things that all writers need to know. All right, Jordan here. So let's get into Stephen King's book On Writing, a memoir of the craft, starting with a little bit of intro into what the book is about. So I've talked in a couple of different videos about how I came to read this book for the first time, so I won't get into that again here, but I will say that I teach this book every year to my AP students, and from teaching it all these years, I've been able to distill this book down to what I think are the 10 essential principles, practices, habits of mind, bits of wisdom that you need to keep in mind if you wish to become a successful writer yourself. First of all, what is this book all about? What's going on in this book? Well, this is Stephen King's attempt to produce a guidebook to writing well. And it's also a memoir of King's life of letters. The book was published in the year 2000, right after Stephen King's infamous accident where this guy hit him with his van, and King was just horribly injured and spent years recovering. So as he was recovering from that accident, he is basically taking stock of his life here and really giving readers an intimate look at his life, first as a kid growing up in poverty, then as a family man struggling to make it as a writer, and then as a really big shot author, best-selling horror writer. Also, King says in the foreword that it was really his friend Amy Tan who inspired him and spurred him to write this book. She was asked what question she wished that the press, that fans would ask her more often, and she said, quote, "No one ever asks about the language." And I'm telling you, you really need to pick this book up if you haven't already. It's not just a book for like hyper serious writers. It's also a book that King fans and even just casual readers, I think, will really enjoy. It's got a very breezy, engaging narrative style. King writes from the first person perspective in the tone of like a very talented op-ed writer. It's easy to read, it's intimate, it's sarcastic, it's conversational. It's just a great book. And I'm not even the biggest Stephen King fan in the world, but I think this is one of his best. I also like the structure of this book. It kind of takes a three-pronged approach. On the one hand, it's a literal guidebook to writing well with tips and strategies for improving your writing in this very organized fashion. It's also an exploration of the writer's life that looks at how to develop good habits and routines, how to stay disciplined, how to make space and time for writing, how to publish even. And then lastly, it's kind of a breezy memoir that literally showcases King writing well. So it's as if King is saying, you want to write well? Well, this is what good writing looks like. And I'm going to show you as I write my memoir what good writing looks like. And so it's got this kind of meta quality to it as well. King talks about the writer's toolbox, how to edit and revise, how to stay inspired, how to cultivate a strong work ethic for writing. But it's also, again, a memoir. And so King is just kind of weaving his life story into all of the writing advice. And I think that's a really interesting way of structuring the book. All right, so let's get into my list of the top 10 principles to writing well. Okay, coming in at number 10, don't plot your books. Don't plot your books. King says, instead of rigorously plotting your books out, put the characters into a predicament, give them challenges, give them obstacles and hurdles to overcome, and then allow themselves to work themselves free. Allow your characters to work themselves free. He talks at length about how your story will likely come out better if you drop your characters into some predicament and then allow them to struggle to overcome difficulties and challenges. And in doing so, you get to know your characters. Your characters develop personalities organically, and the story takes on a life of its own rather than plotting everything out to the nth degree and having this lifeless story. It's similar to George R. R. Martin's advice or his distinction between architects, writers who are more like architects, and then writers who are more like gardeners. King is basically saying your story is going to come out better if you write a little bit more like a gardener and a little bit less like an architect. Coming in at number 9, use the first word that comes to your mind if it is appropriate and colorful. Okay? Use the first word that comes to your mind. And he says if you hesitate and cogitate, it probably won't be as good as the first word you were going to choose or as close to what you really meant to say. Okay, I think this is usually pretty good advice. So this one is kind of about having the language in your story feel natural. You don't want to get out of your flow. You don't want to get in the habit of stopping every sentence to find the exact right word, when the exact right word is probably the one that popped into your head first. Yes, every once in a while, it's okay to use a thesaurus and say, is this really what I was trying to say? But people can kind of tell when you become a walking thesaurus. And so although you want to make sure that you vary your syntax, you also want the language to feel natural and immediate. And so you don't want to overdo it with that thesaurus. So oftentimes the first word that comes into your mind about a character is going to be the most accurate and the most immediate. Number 8, omit needless words. Omit needless words. So I know this sounds like very basic advice, obvious advice, but so much of writing really is concision and saying the most that you can in the fewest number of words possible. And this is certainly key when it comes to editing, revising, rewriting. The process of rewriting and revising is really snipping out, pruning down your work. In fact, King has a little formula that I found to be very useful. King says that your second draft should equal your first draft minus 10%. Interesting. And I'll read another one of King's maxims here. He says, quote, when you're writing a story, you're telling yourself a story. When you rewrite, you're taking out all the things that are not the story. So I really like that, and I think that that's very true. Okay, number 7, fear is at the root of most bad writing. Now, what does King mean by this? Fear is at the root of most bad writing. Well, oftentimes you can kind of tell when you're reading someone's work when they are scared to take risks, when they're afraid to experiment and really open the writing up, really kick the writing into gear. When you're reading someone's work, you can kind of feel it when there's just this timidity about the prose. There's really kind of an impotence when it comes to bad writing. A great novelist, someone like Jane Austen or Charles Dickens or John Updike, you can just feel it. There's a kind of full throttle energy about their prose, a vibrancy, a sense that these authors are really digging beneath the surface and saying something true. And you can feel the sort of pulsing quality of good prose. Whereas there's this kind of cautious, tiptoeing, sort of hunched over feel to a lot of bad writing. So don't be afraid to really rev the engine, take risks, make mistakes. Making mistakes and taking risk is the only way you're going to produce good writing. You may have to throw some stuff out. As King puts it, you need to be able to kill your babies. But taking risks is the only way that you're going to be able to produce good writing. Number 6, pay attention to how the real people around you behave. This is a really great one because I think there is a real tendency among not only beginning but experienced writers to turn their characters into caricatures and to write just generally cliched characters. Now, one reason people do this is, well, one, fear, as we've discussed, but also because cliche characters are easy to latch onto. We all know the cliche, right? So it's familiar to us. So a lot of writers write caricatures and cliched characters because they think that those are the only kinds of characters that people will be able to identify with because they know them. So there's a comfort there, but it's bad writing. Another thing that writers and even actors do is to over-emote, to create these melodramatic characters who don't talk or act like people do in real life, and who react in really weird ways to the things that are happening in the story. So pay attention to the way that real people behave. Another reason this is so important is because you yourself only have one personality. So it helps to observe other people. How do they act? What are their idiosyncrasies? Do they have quirky regionalisms or charming little catchphrases? My boss, for example, has this really distinct Boston accent, and it's just an interesting thing about her character. Again, the reason this matters is because bad authors write characters who are all the same. You can't tell them apart. You'll read some fantasy book and there will be 5 characters going on an adventure together and they just feel like they're all the same person. It's as if the author's personality is being distributed among 5 characters who are really just all the same person, and that's bad writing. Your characters should all feel different. So in order to do that, you have to in effect become a student of people. You're not another person, but you can observe other people, see how they behave, and write those observations that you make into your characters and create these new and vivid characters. Okay, so this next one, number 5, is kind of related to the last one in some ways, and it's this. Description begins in the writer's imagination, but should finish in the reader's. Description begins in the writer's imagination, but should finish in the reader's. In other words, let your readers use their imaginations. Leave something to the imagination. The more details that you give your readers, the less that they are able to populate your story with stuff that comes out of their imaginations. One of the magical things about reading is that there is a real power to it. When you're watching television, it's often a very passive activity. You're sitting back and everything is being fed to you through the boob tube. You don't have to think very much. And you really don't have to use your imagination that much when you're watching television because the picture is being painted for you. But when you read a novel, you get to populate the world in your head. You get to have what they now call your own little head canon. You get to paint the picture and set the scene. The author should just be giving you the rudiments, and that way you as the reader have the real power. And it makes you really enjoy the book better when something is left to the imagination. So don't undermine the reader's power. Don't undermine their autonomy. Give them some room to bring their own interpretation to your work. In other words, don't be a control freak or a tyrant when you write. Write your book in a way that respects your reader's ability to participate in your world. All right, so number 4 on the list is construct your own toolbox. Then build up enough muscle so that you can carry it with you. Construct your own toolbox. I really like this advice because it gets you to start thinking about writing as a craft, as a kind of trade. And as a writer, you really are a craftsman. And I think sometimes it's best to view it that way. There's this myth in literary and intellectual circles that great writers are just these geniuses and that there are these muses up there that just beam great ideas and inspiration into their heads, right? It's like Ernest Hemingway. All he has to do is go on a safari, get into a bar fight, down a bottle of whiskey, and then plop himself down in front of his typewriter, and he just pumps out this gold. Well, typically, it doesn't work that way. Look, there are a lot of published writers out there, and that is not how the vast majority of them learn how to be good writers. Now, King does say that good writing does require a bit of magic and a lot of talent, but the nuts and bolts mechanics of writing matters a lot. And learning the nuts and bolts mechanics of writing is the biggest favor that you can do for yourself. He says, quote, "While it is impossible to make a competent writer out of a bad writer, and while it's equally impossible to make a great writer out of a good one, it's possible with lots of hard work, dedication, and timely help to make a good writer out of a merely competent one." And I think that that message is very inspiring because it means that a merely competent writer like me could one day become a good writer. And so I think that that is a very uplifting message. Becoming a writer is about talent, sure, but it is also about hard work, dedication, discipline, and mastering the craft. So you need to have your own set of tools. And according to King, the tools that you should work at mastering include: 1, developing a competent vocabulary; 2, learning the rules of grammar; 3, developing your own voice as a writer; 4, developing your own style as a writer; 5, learning how dialogue attribution works; 6, mastering the craft at a sentence level; and 7, mastering the craft at a paragraph level. King thinks paragraphs and the mechanics therein are very important. And he goes through each of these elements in the book. And so once you have these things under control, once you know where each of these is located in your toolbox, you're on your way to becoming a good writer, or maybe even a great one. Okay, number 3, read a lot and write a lot. I don't think there's a ton to say about this one, except that writers write a lot, and good writers both read a lot and write a lot. One thing King really emphasizes in this book is that when you start writing, it really does help to read the authors that you admire and to try to emulate them and adopt their style. If you love Nabokov's prose, read a lot of Nabokov and try to get a feel for what he does. If you like John Updike, try to figure out what it is that makes his prose so beautiful and so penetrating, and try to emulate him a little bit. Great writers are not made in a vacuum, so you need to read a lot. King also says that there's this really interesting way in which the more you read an author, the more their style kind of seeps into your own prose in this kind of unconscious and sort of really strange way that is hard to explain. And so the more you read talented authors, the more that kind of seeps into your prose without you even realizing it. Okay, so definitely read a lot. And then, of course, there is write a lot. There are a lot of young people out there who want to know how to become the next great writer, and so they run around asking everyone else they know how to be a writer, going online, spending all of their time in writers' forums, watching videos online about how to write well, what tropes to avoid, how to snag an agent. Some of this is fine, but just realize every minute you spend doing this is a minute that you're not writing, is a minute that you're not honing your craft, gaining valuable experience as a writer. So just sit down, work at it, write your story. And then when you're finished, you can share your story with the world. If you are writing a lot, you are a writer. If you're not writing a lot, you might be a dreamer, you might be an aspiring writer, but you're not a writer. Okay, so every minute, every hour that you can put yourself down in front of the keyboard and really work at your craft, that is never time wasted. Also, I'll note that one semi-related piece of advice to consider is King's idea that when you write, it sometimes helps to have what he calls an ideal reader in your head, someone that you respect and trust, someone hopefully who reads a lot and reads the kind of fiction that you write. In his case, King says that his wife Tabitha is his ideal reader. Tabby is kind of the one-person audience that he has in his mind when he's working on a first draft of a novel. And I thought that that was very good advice as well, to have an ideal reader in your head that you're writing for. Number 2, find a quiet place and shut the door. I think this is an underappreciated and a very important principle for becoming a writer. I love this one because so much about the process of writing is deliberately putting yourself in the position where you can succeed, where you can focus, where you can dream up great stories and put them down on the page without anyone disturbing you. We live in a world at this point of constant distraction, of information overload, of pings and notifications and emails and texts and calls for you to just click on the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. And before you know it, 2 hours have gone by and you have nothing to show for yourself. And I think that is how a lot of people spend their time now. A lot of people live this way. Well, you know what? Successful writers don't live this way. I remember Joyce Carol Oates said this too, that the most important thing that you need to do to become a writer is find a quiet place to shut out the noise of the world and just work. And I think that is virtually irreplaceable. You need to find a place where you feel comfortable, where you feel inspired, where the mood is set and the lighting is just how you like it, and where the people around you will agree to respect your need for privacy so that you can hone your art. Unplug your Wi-Fi router if you have to. Turn off your cell phone. Disable your social media apps. Unplug your house phone. Do whatever you have to do to find peace and get writing done. No excuses. Okay, so finally, clocking in at number 1, the most important thing is simply to tell the truth. As a writer, your job is similar to a comedian's in some ways. Whether your readers know it or not, when they buy your book, they're buying your book because they are searching for the truth. People feel connected to characters who make observations about the world that feel honest. People really like authenticity. And what King says is this. He says, quote, "Your job as a writer is to find the truth within the story's web of lies." Why web of lies? Well, the story that you're writing, of course, is fiction, and so it's not going to have really happened. It's not really true in the strictest sense, but there's a way in which a fictional story can be true or false, honest or dishonest, real or phony, nonetheless. A great novel can be, in fact, and I've said this before, more true than real life because stories offer you a meta-truth. It's aggregated wisdom. Stories reveal universal truths through specific and particular experiences. It's universality, so universal in the sense that we can all identify with the plight of the character, but it's also specific because you're putting that experience in one person's head, that it's our job as readers to identify with and empathize with. Your job as a writer is to have your eyes open to the truth and to let that truth breathe through your characters and through your story. As a writer, King says, your job is not to be beholden to political correctness. It's not to be dogmatic or ideologically rigid. You're not writing to push some agenda. Your job is to tell the truth as you see it without fear or favor. And so I think that is a very, very important, perhaps the most important ingredient for a writer is to tell the truth. All right, that's it for today's video. Thank you for tuning in to iWizard. As always, please check in with me via Facebook, Patreon, Goodreads. Until next time, happy reading.